Hello, and welcome to Connections 2021 EAB Hunt. We're here with Dr. Nolan Noble from the Center for Naval Analysis, or CNA. Dr. Noble has a PhD in economics from Notre Dame. He is also a very experienced operational analyst, having done 2 6-month deployments with operational carrier strike groups. What he's going to be talking about today are some interesting mechanics that he's developed for an information operations game designed to look at expeditionary airbase operations, which is what the Marines do when they don't want their main air bases blown up. So I'll turn it over now to Dr. Noble. Thank you.
Ed, thank you for that introduction. Today I'm going to talk about EAB Hunt. As Ed was saying, it is a prototype of a war game that is designed to provide training for operations in the information environment. For those of you that aren't familiar, an EAB is an Expeditionary Advanced Base. It's the Marine Corps' version of multi-domain operations, MDO. Now, while I've called this game EAB Hunt, we could easily think of this as MDO Hunt, or as I go through it, and you'll see, we could think of this more broadly than just that. We could put anything in this game that we want to play, and in fact, this is very much so a sandbox game. I designed EAB Hunt along with Justin Peachy, and we designed it as a way for Marines to conceptualize and interact with the amorphous information environment and its many subdomains. As I move on, I just want to throw out a quick disclaimer. Anything I say here represents my own opinion. It does not represent that of CNA, the Navy, the Marine Corps, or any of CNA's other sponsors. Now, from my perspective, the Marine Corps could benefit from an operations in the information environment training, or more training, and it could benefit from that via a war game specifically. So looking at the Marine Corps, the Commandant's planning guidance, he specifically calls out the hider-finder battle and long-range precision fires as dominating the future operating environment. My takeaway from that is any Marine, at least any Marine that's under the threat of those long-range precision fires, has a role in that hider-finder battle. The next part of it is, and the Commandant specifically calls out the value of wargaming for training and education. Wargames provide that synthetic environment, the ability to fail fast to learn. You can try out things in a war game that you wouldn't try out in the real world. And worst case scenario in the game, if it doesn't go the way you want it to, you just play the game again. Now, in this brief, I'm going to do a quick how do you actually play Carrier Hunt. Then I'll do an overview of the game. The overview of the game is going to be eye chart style. And then next, as Ed was saying, I want to spend most of my time in this talk talking about 2 of the mechanics that we introduced with EAB Hunt. So first, how do you play EAB Hunt? Well, realistically, given that it's a prototype, you need someone like me or someone else who helped design it to actually run this game for you. All snarkiness aside, this game is broken out into 2 phases. So there's a preparation phase, and this begins with a communal tell me about your EAB. So no one's been assigned to a side just yet, and everybody works together and starts discussing what they think their EAB looks like. So this could range from something of, I want to have a single HIMARS battery, to, well, I want to bring an entire MEU with me. Or we could do something that's not an EAB. We could instead talk about a ship. We could talk about a unit in garrison. We could talk about anything. As I get through the next couple of slides, you'll see how that works. And so while players, they're sort of building, this is what my EAB looks like, or this is what I want to think about for this game, facilitators start asking questions for the next phase of the game. And the questions that they're asking are really about trying to get at, what does this EAB look like in the information environment? How is it operating? What is its command and control, its C2 structure like? How does it receive tasking from the Joint Force Maritime Component Commander, the JFMC? And how do they roger back out? Oh, I've completed that tasking. What does this EAB look like in the information environment? After this has been sussed out and decided upon, then players are roughly split in half and assigned to red and assigned to blue. And then we move on to the operations phase. Operations phase is simply broken out into 2 rounds. The execution round starts, one player takes an action, the next player takes an action, it goes on and on. We use meeples as a simple way to denote sort of this economy. After both sides can't take any more actions, they're exhausted, we move to the upkeep round, everybody gets their meeples back, and we start over, and the game just keeps going back and forth through this until the game is over. So with that, I want to provide a quick overview of EAB Hunt. This is our prototype of it. I completely understand that it's a bit eye-charty, and that's intentionally so. I don't want to spend my time focusing here. EAB Hunt is a 2-sided non-zero-sum game, and as I said, it sort of starts off with this communal discussion. In terms of the 2 sides, we have a red player depicted here, and then we have a blue player. Each side has their own separate area, and then what I want to get into next is we added a red player after sort of an evolution in these hunt games that we've been working on. And one of the things that we had noticed is sometimes when red is included, red is all of red versus just a part of blue. And so we appreciate the fact that if the US is going to go to war, it's not just going to be the Marines, it's going to be the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, it's going to be the joint force. So if we're going to think about a game that's instead going to take just a part of that, we want red to be somewhat equal to that. And the way that we achieve that in this game is we have, instead of red playing all of red, red is a part of red, and red starts off with a small set of forces, and then through a request for forces process can get access to more forces. Now, I'd said this is a non-zero-sum game. What that means is there's non-mutually exclusive win conditions. Either side can win this game regardless of whether or not the other side won. The way that we account for that in the game, the red player is less focused on, say, winning the exercise or the scenario or the war, and is instead focused on climbing their own political military totem pole. And so their goal is to be at the top of that totem pole come the end of the game. The blue player, instead, their goal is to support the Joint Force Maritime Component Command of the JIFMIC, and they're awarded campaign points anytime they do things that the JIFMIC would be pleased with. And they get more points if the JIFMIC is especially pleased with that. If the blue player accumulates enough of these campaign points, they win the game. If the red player is at the top of the totem pole at the end of the game, they win the game. Now that said, right, so I've spoken how we added a red player because we wanted someone that would counter blue. And then we wanted to be very careful in how we're introducing that. We wanted to make sure that the red player is focused on the right things and not just trying to cheat, for lack of a better word. So one of the ways that we added back in that competitive nature was through these event cards depicted here in the middle of the screen. Each of these event cards is 2-sided. There's a red side and a blue side. Once one of the players has activated one of the sides, that event card is out of the game. And then the next thing about our prototype, and this is one of the things that I'm going to spend much more time on talking about, are these information environment boards. These are the depictions of the EABs in the game. And it's that communal process sort of builds the center of them. And then the facilitator asking questions populates encounters on the exterior of them to represent them in the information environment. And that is a quick overview, granted a bit eye-charty, of our prototype. With that, I want to dive a little bit more and talk specifically about the information environment board. What this is basically a giant tracker or status board for the EAB in the information environment. We've broken it out into 7 different subdomains: human intelligence or HUMINT, open source, imagery. We've set aside this catch-all category of other. I'm sure there's something that we've already missed in these 7 categories, and I'm sure as things develop and time moves on and new technologies become available, there'll be some new. subdomain that we haven't even thought of yet. So we wanted to be sure to capture this in this generic other category. And then we have signals, and then out of signals, we've specifically called out commercial communications. And then last, we've added this more squishy hearts and minds category. So the EAB, it goes depicted there in the center. This could be a HIMARS battery with some support vehicles and some Marines. And it is surrounded in the information environment by these different encounters that I've populated there. And we liked that feel for both players. So the blue player, they're surrounded by the information environment, and they're working to push stuff out and keep stuff further away from them. Whereas the red player is surrounding that EAB in the information environment, and they're working to move those different things in so they can turn that EAB into something that's targetable, if not better. So with that, for this audience, a bunch of wargamers, I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about where this information environment board came from, what else did we consider, and why is it a circle? So the first thing we started off with was thinking about, reading Marine Corps, what they're thinking in terms of open source press. And the first thing we came across was thinking of physical, technical, and administrative. And we started thinking, okay, so that's one way to think about this. How would we put this into a game? So imagine I had a cell phone. So that has a physical component. And then I call someone, that now has a technical component. We'll say that I'm calling them because I'm mustering them. I'm mustering for something. Okay, well now it's administrative. So this one cell phone, if I was going to use physical, technical, and administrative, I'm going to need to track it 3 times in 3 different things. And so because of that, we sort of threw away the physical, technical, admin sort of way of thinking about this. And then we sort of moved on to the next idea. We looked at the 7 functions of Marine Corps OIE, operations in the information environment. And we looked at this, and some of them just didn't feel right. So some of them were okay, we're going to attack via this subdomain. Yet others we're going to defend by this one. So if we were thinking about a 2-player game, we'd potentially have attacks going down one vector and the defense for it coming down a different vector. And we didn't like the feel of that. Now, as you can see or quickly count, we do have 7 subdomains here. So we like that 7 aspect of it, but we changed what specifically was included. So we did take a big note from that. Hearts and minds part of those 7 functions plays heavily. So we were sure to capture that. And then we turned to a game that we had worked on previously, Carrier Hunt, and thought about it and what we could steal from that. So we stole a couple of things from that. And just I want to take a quick detour from what I'm talking about and just mention of why is it a circle. So we turned to what we had for Carrier Hunt. And in Carrier Hunt, we had sort of this linear depiction. And we started off looking at that and quickly realized that this linear depiction just doesn't work. For one sense, and I only realized this in creating this slide deck, is if we did all 7 light out horizontally, it just takes up too much space. So it's a ex post realization that making it a circle makes it take up less space. And there's sort of the full depiction of it in that horizontal thing. The next thing that we realized from Carrier Hunt, we took away some of the categories there, and we then started thinking of Carrier Hunt. It's about a carrier in the middle of the ocean, and if instead we're thinking about EAB Hunt, it's Marines operating in some host nation, and the difference between those two is the ocean does not care at all about anything operating on, below, or above its surface. That is absolutely not the case operating in a host nation. They care how you operate there. So, reinforced the notion that we have to include hearts and minds. The other thing that went right along with this is this EAB is operating in a sea of people. One of the things that comes out of that is, okay, well, now we need to start worrying about human intelligence, the potential for not necessarily insider threats, but anyone from the host nation that could see something and report back on that. Now, when thinking about people come with cell phones, and people on their cell phones, they often end up on social media. So as a result of that, we added commercial comms and very quickly open source. And that rounded out, right? And we previously had included imagery and signals, and that rounded out our selection of the 7 subdomains. And then the next thing that sort of came into consideration of why is it a circle and how did we get to this depiction is the physical consideration of thinking about printing a physical board. So as I showed on the earlier side, we wanted to have the players build their EABs in the center of this and then have its depiction surrounded. So what that meant is the center of the board had to be at least so big so that players could actually put icons and figures and pieces in there. And then we wanted to be able to print this on our printers, which meant that we sort of had a maximum. So this gave us a minimum amount of space and a maximum amount of space that we could take up. And then the main implication was going to be how to delimit the space in between those, how to subcategorize those subdomains. Ultimately, what we ended up with was detectable, locatable, and targetable. So the outermost ring is this detectable and friendly ring. So friendly, we decided that for hearts and minds, we couldn't call it detectable, locatable, and targetable, and instead it's friendly, neutral, and hostile. Outermost ring is our detectable, friendly ring. Going in a step is the locatable, neutral ring. And then the innermost step is this targetable, hostile ring. So what came from physical considerations, we thought of doing more delineations, but the problem was that if we actually wanted to put pieces on these, that if we went with any more than 3, it wouldn't be enough space to have that many pieces depicting this EAB in the information environment. And so from that, we settled on detectable, locatable, and targetable for friendly, neutral, hostile for hearts and minds. And that's how we spaced things out. For the encounters, which I've sort of mentioned, we've created 30 of them. And specifically thinking about an EAB operating ashore in a host nation country, we wanted to think about persistent encounters, something that gets populated on the board and it stays there. You always need to think about how you're interacting with that. And then taking from that, we realized that different things in the information environment require that you interact with them differently. So imagine sort of looking in the top in the center there at that UAV encounter 14. Right, okay, there's a UAV operating near the EAB. We're going to interact with that one way. Okay, well now what if we know that that UAV is associated with a child? Potentially we're going to want to interact with that UAV in a different way. We may not, we may. And then suppose that EAB is the grandchild of a community elder. Well, now we potentially really want to interact with that UAV differently, knowing that it's not only attached to a child, but at a community elder, someone who's going to potentially affect that EAB's access to that space. And that's what we wanted to be able to capture with these encounters, is not sort of a universal, this is how we interact with the information environment, but rather an appreciation that different things in the information environment require that you interact with them differently. So for example, we could think of how our own radars versus potentially threat radars. We may need to think about our satellite communications. We may need to think about interacting with local law enforcement. We may need to think about interacting with, say, a news van that shows up and parks right outside our EAB. All of these different things we need to think about, potentially think about different ways that we want to approach them so that we can achieve the desired effect. One of the questions I almost always get asked about these encounters is, what is the green little number and why are they non-sequential? So the green little number is simply an identifier. The reason they're non-sequential is because this is a prototype. As we made future changes to the game, we didn't want to have to insert new numbers or change our whole numbering system. So instead we did non-sequential numbers so that we could easily add additional encounters as we continue to develop this prototype. And with that, I want to get to the next of the two mechanics that I really wanted to spend my time discussing. So up to this point, everything I've discussed is completely deterministic. Stuff just happens or doesn't. And based off of my experience and what I've read, right, randomness has had a huge impact on some wars and some battles and some outcomes. So it was very important to me that we include some version of randomness in this game. It just became a question of how we do that. So the first thing that we had naturally thought of was, oh, we could do dice, we could do die rolls, we can have tables, and we can account for randomness that way. The next thing we thought about is we could use cards, right? Number of different ways that we can use cards. Players could play cards, or they could randomly flip over cards, and it could be sort of a card-driven randomness mechanic. Now, sitting back and thinking about that, neither one of these quite felt right. They just didn't feel like what we wanted to include for this game. And it took a little while, and we realized that both of these are really on the extrinsic margin. They answer questions of if this happens. Which didn't feel like the type of game that we wanted. If you're playing a game of hide and seek, it's a question of when you're found. It's not so much, unless you're playing with particularly cruel children, it's not a question of if you get found. So what we wanted for our randomness mechanic for EAB Hunt in particular, which is thinking of this hide and seek style game, we wanted a mechanic that embodied this question of when. So we turned to a game that I had been playing, if not playing, certainly reading a lot about, Dread. If you're not familiar with Dread, it is a suspense-based, suspense-driven RPG. And what it uses as its way to achieve randomness is Jenga. It has a Jenga tower. So this is what we use for EAB Hunt. This is our Intrinsic-Margin stochastic mechanic. Anything that happens with some level of certainty goes to the Jenga tower. Anything that happens with certainty simply happens. Anything that doesn't happen with certainty simply doesn't happen. If you write anything that we might think has some level of randomness, or it may or may not happen, that requires a pull from the Jenga tower. If the Jenga tower falls, there's a consequence associated with that. Generally, the consequence affects either player's victory condition. Now, thinking about, once we had decided on, okay, we're going to include a Jenga tower, this matches that question of when, right? When the EAB is found, not if the EAB is found. Once we had decided on that, we were starting to think, okay, well, how do we do this? So the first thing we had thought of is, okay, so we'll have two Jenga towers. We'll have one for red and we'll have one for blue. And each can sort of think about this separately. And the first thing, I don't even think we had to test that out before we threw it out. It was just, well, they're just going to be shaking the table or otherwise constantly trying to cheat and make the other player's tower fall down. So we collapsed down and decided to have a single shared Jenga tower. And the niceness out of that is it's going to enforce itself. One of the things that I've noticed is everyone, at least everyone in the playtests that we've had, is familiar with Jenga. And so we haven't had to explain it with that, and it's naturally understood. Once I say when the Jenga tower falls, something bad happens, we don't have to look at the die and sort of realize like, okay, is that the number I was going for or not? It's simply, did the tower fall or not? And of course, the other side benefit of including Jenga is it's this physical embodiment of risk. And it's very clear instantly to players as they're playing the game, and it's not even something that they're conscious of. So we start off the game, we have the Jenga tower pristine, untouched, right? And so there we're in the green in terms of risk. As the game moves along and some pieces have started being taken out, maybe it wobbles once or twice, we've moved over into the yellow. And then finally, there's sort of that last point when it's near teetering, about to fall at any moment. We're clearly in the red, and it's been so rewarding to watch players instantly appreciate this physical manifestation of risk, and they get it that the Jenga tower is risk. Just looking at my time, it looks like I do have a little bit of time, so I'll share a little C story on the development of this series of games. If you were watching my panel, the panel I was in yesterday, you may have heard a little bit of this. For a previous version of this game, Carrier Hunt, we went down to the sponsor. We did a week-long set of play tests with the sponsor, and they were rotating different play testers out for us. One of those play tests went perhaps as bad as it could have gone. And it was really all about, they lost the game at the last minute on a bad die roll, and they just absolutely hated everything as a result of that. So because of that, when we turned to EAB Hunt, we were like, okay, well, we can't use dice because of that visceral reaction we had come across. The other thing, sort of thinking about that, is this is meant to be a training game. We want players learning more about operations in the information environment, and that's what we want them taking away. I think it's a valuable thing. One of the reasons that you want to use a war game for training or education is because you want to teach players about loss, about losing. But that didn't elevate to the top of things for us here. And so we wanted to abstract and sort of bury that a little bit. And that's part of why we took dice out of it and instead went with Jenga. One of the other things that I like about Jenga that I wouldn't have occurred to me when I first included it, but it's come out of the playtests that we've done. When players walk in the room, they see the Jenga tower sitting there next to the other boards, and they all instantly accept that something bad is going to happen to them at some point during the game. With the other games that I've done where I've used dice or cards, that's not the case. There almost always ends up being in one playtest or run through, there's someone who just sort of like, no, I don't believe that, and you get pushed back to it. I've not encountered that yet with the Jenga tower. That doesn't mean I won't. But I've liked that. There's this implicit acceptance with the Jenga tower and associating, okay, once it falls, there's going to be a consequence. The players have all appreciated that something bad is going to happen to them at some point during this game. The other thing that I've noted from Jenga, as opposed to, say, dice or cards, is players feel in control. They feel like their ability to get the pull that they need and not have the Jenga tower fall, they feel in control of it, which sort of helps part of that buy-in, as opposed to when they're rolling die, unless they've brought in their own loaded die, they don't feel like they're in control of it. And I like that deceptive nature of it, and I feel that helps player buy-in, and it moves past the, okay, something bad is going to happen to them. Yep, got it, something bad happened. How are you going to respond? And it gets players back on the decisions that we want them thinking about. All right, so just sort of coming out to the close of my comments, I think I was talking a little bit faster than I practiced. I just want to state that EAB Hunt is still a prototype. There's still things that need to be incorporated or fixed about it. The first of them, and this has come across, I think, through this connections and perhaps connections online, of thinking about, if we want this to be a war game for training or education purposes, there are some things that you can learn playing a game once, right? If we're thinking about exposure of like, I just want to make you aware of these things, you can get that out of playing a game once. But if what we're trying to get you to learn is something that only comes out of the mechanics, then you have to play the game multiple times, which means that for our current version of EAB Hunt, it would probably have to play faster. The game right now is probably too complex. We need to simplify it down so that it can play faster, so that those things that you learn from really experiencing the mechanics, that you have a chance to actually learn those. the harkening back to what I said earlier, you can try something out in the game, and if it doesn't work, just play the game again. Well, that you can only really play the game again if it's fast enough and easy enough to play it again. Of course, on the flip side of that is more cowbell. I think every time I've run this game, someone has said, "Ooh, you should add this," or "You should add this." Now, some of those, like, absolutely agree with, like, maybe we should figure out a way to include logistics or more explicitly include comms as part of this. But that's sort of the trade-off, right? We have to speed this thing up so that it can play faster, so that we can get that benefit of multiple playthroughs for learning. But we also need to balance this with adding some of those elements that might not be there that should be there. The second to last thing I'll say is, when we initially set out to create EAB Hunt, we wanted an in-the-box design, something that I can pack up, ship to someone, ship to a command, ship to some Marines, and they can play it themselves. That's not currently the case. It requires someone like me from the design team to currently run the game. And that's something that we hope to be able to change in the future. And then the last thing that really keeps it in that prototype status is it needs more play testing. We've had a couple of play tests that have broken different aspects of this game, but we've not been able, some of the things in the game still require testing of the scaling. Are players actually learning what we want them to learn? Are they interacting with it the way that we expected them to? And doing that continuous version of play testing and making sure that we have a good game that couldn't go in the box, that we can ship to someone, and they're not going to run into something that was unforeseen. And with that is everything I had planned to say. So I will hand it back over to Ed to open things up for questions.
Got to unmute myself first. I'm going to do things a little bit differently this time and come in and do the questions kind of live. And Tim Smith asks, and I also had this question, but I phrased it differently. He's never understood the utility of gamification. He means the Jenga tower. The use of mechanisms that do not correlate to cause and effect in the object's processes being modeled. Why not just use models and isomorphic to the situation being modeled? My way of putting it is, especially with a Jenga tower, your probability distribution is non-linear across the turns or across the course of the game. How do you deal with this problem that you're kind of skewing the distribution by using the Jenga tower?
So my thinking on this has changed through different playthroughs, and I've not yet reaccounted for it. So one of the things that I've noticed, this sort of gamification, is early in the game, players they're risk seeking. They do things that they probably wouldn't otherwise do because they think the risk state is lower. And then as we sort of transition and the Jenga tower gets much closer to falling, right, this non-linearness, they flip and change their behavior. They switch over to risk aversion, and they stop doing things that they'd otherwise want to do. Now, this becomes a point of discussion that I, as a facilitator, raise to the players. Like, okay, so if we were looking at a risk to mission or risk to force tracker, if you started over in the green, does that mean that you're going to do riskier things than you would otherwise do? And as you shift over to the red, are you going to stop doing things that you maybe need to do just because you're in the red? And so that becomes a discussion point. In terms of the mechanic, I have been thinking through ways to smooth out that nonlinearness. One of the things that I have thought of is we could imagine print on each of the Jenga pieces sort of like a shape or something, and pull until you get this shape. That way it's not a single pull, but an uncertain number of pulls. And that might be a way to smooth out this nonlinearness and sort of get away from that gaminess of, well, at the start we know there's low risk, but maybe really not.
Yeah, and as a follow-up to that, did you consider other types of mechanics? And if you did, what were they that you thought of? And obviously, dice would be one of them, but to sort of this display of risk, I find to be very fascinating. Did you consider other things that were Jenga?
Yes. So I I've had multiple conversations about this. The one thing that we really toyed with was the idea of using a deck of cards, and we had numerous discussions about how do we get this sort of same effect from cards. I'd say one of the problems with cards is that as it gets smaller and smaller, it's less obvious and it's less visceral to the Jenga tower, right? Running out of a card deck lacks that nice thud of the Jenga tower. So we did think about it, and it was only recently someone mentioned to me another way to potentially account for this. There was at least one playtest that we had that they hated the Jenga tower. And another way to do this is instead we can imagine a bag and have pieces in the bag, and they pull pieces out of the bag, and some level of replacement or non-replacement to sort of get the right probabilities that we wanted.
And also, as another follow-up for Tim's question, what would an isomorphic model to the situation look like? In other words, what is really going on here? And so even just explaining what is really going on when they pull the Jenga blocks would be helpful in understanding that.
So, sorry, I'm pausing for a moment. Thinking about, so what's going on with the Jenga tower? The Jenga tower, a pull from the Jenga tower is required anytime there's something that happens with some randomness, right? It may not happen. And so what I was thinking of this is that sort of like risk to mission or risk to force tracker. Anytime we do something that's risky is going to move us a little bit along that. So our cumulative risk is increasing as time is going on. And that's embodied by the Jenga tower. So anytime we do something that may not work or may have some element of risk associated with it, we take a piece out of the Jenga tower and put it on the top. And as over time, right, that cumulative risk is increasing, that Jenga tower gets closer and closer, and ultimately.
So the Jenga tower is an integral of the risk, not necessarily an isolated event of the risk. So it's not like rolling a die. It's integrating risk across time, and eventually it's going to go bad for you one way or the other.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. That makes that. I think that makes sense. The amazing Sebastian Bay asks, what are some of the elements of EAB Hunt that you want to work on?
I have a long list of different things that I want to work on for EAB Hunt. I think I've, at least in my mind, I think I've improved the Jenga tower mechanic and how to smooth out some of the non-linearityness with that. One of the other things that's sort of been on my list for EAB Hunt is right now it's very much a sandbox game. Players come and can play any EAB that they want. And I think one of the things that needs to happen for it to be an in-the-box game is to have some sort of pre-builds of, okay, here's your starting position. One of the reasons that I hadn't done that yet is because I have, every time I've run the build your EAB part of that, there's such a rich discussion, and it's sort of like that first eureka moment of, oh, like this is actually what this looks like in the information environment. That's what this policy would look like if I think about this means of C2 versus this means of C2. And so I haven't yet solved that. How do I get that right balance of having these eye-opening discussions while also having something that's pre-built? The other thing that's on my list to really go to, and I really liked from Sebastian's Fleet Marine Force, was all of his different cards and different things that he could include there. Right now, the events that are included in EAB Hunt are basically in-game mechanics only, and they don't map over the real world, and they don't have that story. And I think that's probably also high on my list of what to start including with EAB Hunt. And I'm sure
this does seem like a fairly abstract game.
Right now it is a fairly abstract game. One of the decisions that we made intentionally very early on was we didn't want it played on a physical map. My impression of infantry Marines is if you give them a physical map, they will use maneuver as their solution. And so I wanted, maneuver absolutely is one of the solutions to operate to some problems in the information environment, but it's not the solution, and it doesn't work for everything. So I wanted to take that out of the things that were available to them and instead play with a map that is the information environment.
The apparently ever curious Mr. Sebastian Bay asks, so do riskier moves require more pulls from the Jenga tower, or does it require specific pulls from specific places?
So the way it is right now, most everything requires a single pull from the game. At least in the rules that I have written down now. In subsequent play tests from that, I've house ruled some things, and sometimes I'll require additional pulls. I haven't thought about requiring it from a specific sector of the Jenga tower. I have thought about some matching mechanics where we could put like a number 1 on some of the Jenga blocks, and we put a 2 or a 3, and keep pull until you find this number, or make a first pull and pull until you match, or something like that. But I haven't actually incorporated those into the game yet.
Okay, Mr. Odiera, whose first name I unfortunately can't pronounce, asks, what are your contact details? I'm sure that you'll be able to put those in the chat later if you wish to, for potentially participating in an EAB Hunt playtesting. So is playtesting open, or is it restricted to certain people?
Playtesting is restricted to some people right now. The version that I have at EAB Hunt has to be played at the official use only level.
Okay. Mr. Odiera has another question. Vish has another question. As the stochastic modeling methodology reduces the burden from bounded accuracy and structural accuracy, what is next for the core mechanics, and how would you develop this in the future distributed wargaming environment?
So I'm going to approach the latter half of this question first. How would I approach this in the distributed gaming environment? I've already been able to play this game distributed but mostly via virtual means, which I've done at the unclass and higher levels, making use of Zoom Gov and other things. The hard part is generally I'll ask them to buy a Jenga tower and have a Jenga tower available. And that's the only physical thing that you need to play the game. The rest of it can be run via, say, PowerPoint and a share screen. And I'd appreciate a repeat of the first half of that question.
Sure. As a stochastic modeling methodology reduces the burden from bounded accuracy and structural accuracy, what is next for the core mechanics? I'm not sure I understand that either.
Well, that makes me feel a little bit better.
Yeah. I maybe it's along the lines of what might you do next?
So I think the next part is for thinking about the Jenga tower in particular, is thinking about how to smooth out that perception of risk so that I don't get players overly risk seeking at the beginning and then overly risk averse once that tower gets too close to falling, and smoothing that out a little bit more so it's less loading, what some players have referred to as front loading on risk. I'd say the other part of it is one of the things that I've adapted as I run through demos and play tests of it is having that discussion of, okay, I've just seen how you were interacting with the Jenga tower. This is risk. And then sort of mapping that back over to their decisions in the real world, or how they might make decisions in the real world, and getting them to have that sort of thought there.
The very educational Mr. Sebastian Bay really likes that idea, so I just passed that along to you.
Well, thanks, Sebastian.
Evan asks, we have 15 minutes, by the way. Evan asks, why not just take some blocks out at the start of the game to give perception that there is already risk?
Absolutely something I could do. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it before, but that's something else that could be done, is start with some version of a pre-deconstructed Jenga tower. Absolutely. Thank you.
I I want to go back to the little circles that we had at first, and I always like to think IO is best characterized by Marine Corps operational doctrine, which is saying something because I don't think anything's very well characterized by Marine Corps operational doctrine. But I think IO doctrine is really good, and they have this they have this series of IRCs, information related capabilities. Your circle did not have all the IRCs in it. Nor did it seem to have all of the what you're really doing is counterintelligence, right? So it did not have all of the ones that might impact counterintelligence on the circle. So why, and what's going on there?
So there's a couple different things there. So first, the sort of question of how to incorporate IRCs into this game. I wanted the play space to not necessarily be IRCs, but rather where those IRCs sort of fall into. So in terms of thinking about information-related capabilities, those would be the type of things that the Marines would have as part of their EAB. And then as we started talking about, okay, well, let's say this radar populated and signals moved in towards you guys. Okay, well, you have an IRC that would counter that. So, okay, so maybe we wouldn't move that in. And so that's instead how the IRCs would come into play in this game. When the encounters move in or out from the board, it'd be, for the Marines pushing them out, potentially it would be via their IRCs. And what I wanted for the board itself was instead to sort of be the domain that the IRCs are moving in. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, for example, if the adversary infiltrated and was exfiltrating information from the host nation ATC capabilities, you would then assume that there was a cyber IRC that was pushing that back, or a jamming, or even unlucky for the host nation, a kinetic IRC that would push that back.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And now, do the players get those IRCs like little tickets or something, or?
No. So this comes to the sandbox part of this design. One of the decisions that we made early on, given we had relatively limited resources to create this, is we intentionally stayed away from creating an inventory of IRCs that players could use. And instead, when players come and play the game, it's up to them to bring that. The other advantage of that is, well, we started designing this game in March 2020, right about when COVID hit. So we had to switch from being able to design this game in our office to instead being able to having to design this game from home, which meant switching that this had to be an unclassified game at its base level, and then being able to incorporate potentially classified elements.
Well, the always educational Mr. Sebastian Bay says, what is a unit or command you would love to use this for educational training purposes?
So I think I was going to say high on my list is Marine Corps Training Command or Training and Education Command. I'd love for this to get out to units underneath them and start thinking about the information environment, about just thinking about it by this visualization. And I've also liked the sub goal of thinking of risk and sort of getting players to think about their risk preferences and decisions in this game and how that maps over the real world.
And one of the things that I'm very much sort of a do it kind of person, so I have a hard time with targets as opposed to actions. But the red player, if they were targeting a particular thing, might use synergy. So in other words, for example, they might use EW to try to push people to certain social media sites, which would then allow them to better target them with cyber. So is there a synergy between those different tracks that come in, even for the red player, if not the blue player? And also, can the blue player use their IRCs in synergistic ways like that, or is it all very stovepipe?
So for the red player, one of the things that we wanted to see was something that we think embodies reality, which is exactly what you were just discussing of. I'm not just going to try and find them via one means. I'm going to use multiple means. So the way that we incorporate that in the game is if any one encounter is in that innermost ring, the targetable ring, that EAB is targetable. If you have at least 3 in the locatable ring, then it's targetable. And if you have at least 5 in that outermost ring, it's targetable. So that was our way of capturing that idea of, we're not just going to look at it via one thing, but we're going to have multiple things. That may not be the best way to do it, but at least that's how we've done it thus far.
And so how do you assess the value of the game itself? Do you have an assessment methodology that you use? Maybe you went over this and I wasn't paying attention, but in other words, you're playing it multiple times and it's either for training, education, or research. How do you assess how you're doing with the game in terms of achieving whatever objectives you're trying to achieve?
Sorry, I'm pausing there. So thus far, so this is a training game, and thus far the assessments have all been based off of how the people that have played it have reacted to it. Did they start thinking? And I sort of think of that in the two means of, did they start thinking about operations in the information environment differently, or did they start thinking about risk differently? And then judging the nature of the discussion that we had throughout the game. I may have glossed over this, but basically anytime the blue player attempts to move one of these encounters further away from them, there's generally a discussion associated with that. How are you doing this? What IRC or what capability is letting you do this? And that's right, and sort of gauging the quality of that discussion has been how I've assessed its success.
And inevitably what people are going to want to do is either digitize this or put it in a box. And you keep referring back to the facilitation of the game. What do you think about the ability to put this in a box and shrink wrap it, or put it on digitally and do it digitally without a facilitator?
So I'm probably in the camp that prefers a facilitator for a training or education game. There's some behavior, right? Like versions of cheating or fighting the scenario that the box can't defend against and the computer can't defend against. And you need a human to say okay, yes, you can break that mechanic, but you're just wasting your own time if you're doing that. The other part of it is I go back and forth as to whether or not this is a game with discussion or discussion with a game. And if you fully digitize it, I think you would lose some of that. You'd need some version of someone running it to sort of have that discussion. Now that said, right, you could potentially have a spell book or a list of IRCs and okay, read up here, read more. But that's reading more loses some of the value of having this via a game. And so to the in the box side of it, I think you could easily sort of map this with a train the trainer, or sort of have, this is the white cell handbook, and you're going to be the one that runs this game versus you're going to be someone who plays this game.
One of the things I think is really interesting, and we only have about 5 minutes left, is Use Dread, which is an indie game. I assume it's an indie game. Use Dread as your inspiration for some of the mechanics. Where should people go to try to find out about what's new in the indie press? Because I also happen to believe that the indie RPG press is probably the place to look for new ideas. Where should they go to try to do that?
I have no idea. I think I just crawl through Board Game Geek and see what they have there, and randomly Google games and look on Amazon of what's there, and then look through various lists. I think at one point I used to follow Geek and Sundry and just sort of what new games were out, reading about those. Dread had been on my list for a while. I think it was only after my second deployment that I finally got a copy of it and read through it. And then I was like, ooh, I'm intrigued by this. And then it was a couple years later that I was like, ooh, now I see how I can actually use this in a game and what its value would be. So I certainly don't have any great ideas on how to be more aware of this stuff and how to incorporate it into games faster. because I think the total time between when I first heard about Dread and then read about it and included in a game was probably like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I find Kickstarter to be one place, but even with that, it's very difficult to sort of identify the good new sorts of games that are coming out,
Yeah.
that are in the indie space as opposed to the D&D or Wizards or whatever. All right. Well, I will leave you. Hopefully, Colonel Lord will pull me back behind the curtain, and you can finish by summarizing. So, thank you.
All right. So thank you everyone for listening. I briefly spoke through EAB Hunt. It's a training war game to help Marines in particular. At least that's what it was designed for. But it could be anyone, to help them conceptualize and interact with the amorphous information environment and its subdomains. The two mechanics that I spoke through today, we have the information environment board, which has that physical depiction of surrounding EABs in the information environment, and having players think through what that EAB looks like in the information environment, what their signals, what their depiction is, what it is, and how they can manage that. The other big part of this is the getting players to start thinking about risk and how their reaction to risk affects their decisions, both in the game and in the real world. And I found it incredibly rewarding to watch players interact with both of these things in ways that I expected and in ways that I didn't expect. Thank you.